In 2022, a young Ugandan woman fell to her death in Dubai. Social media was abuzz with speculation about her life, her choices, and how she died. But beneath the noise, the real story was still missing. That's when Afro-Caribbean British storyteller Runako Celina stepped in. As an investigative journalist for the BBC, Runako has spent years shedding light on stories that affect people of color across the globe. Raised in Bristol and London within a deeply Pan-African Caribbean community, Runako's work is shaped by heritage, migration, and a refusal to let others speak for us. Her breakout investigation, Racism for Sale, exposed the exploitation of Africans by Chinese expats. Now, in her most recent documentary, Death in Dubai, Runako digs deep into the exploitation of African migrant women, moving beyond headlines to center the humanity so often missing from mainstream coverage. In this episode of Black and Borderless, we're asking the harder questions. What inspires her to keep telling these heart-wrenching stories, even when it puts her safety at risk? How does she remain grounded while confronting injustice inflicted on people who look like her? And how does she infuse humanity into stories about people the world too often ignores? Find out in this episode of Black and Borderless. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am super excited to have you on, needless to say. I'm a huge fan, so I'm totally fangirling right now. It's funny because you and I met virtually a couple of weeks ago,
I
and
messaged you
we,
because I love the platform.
yes, thank you. No, thank you. And you actually, I think you reached out to me initially, right? Which I
Yeah.
was pretty humbled and flattered by. But I hadn't even seen the documentary, the Death and Dubai documentary, even Racism for Sale. I hadn't seen when you first reached out to me. But after I watched it, I was like, I was left, my mouth was left open at the end. Both were incredible. And we're going to talk about both documentaries in a minute and kind of the work that you're doing with really highlighting stories of, about people of color across the world and really, as an investigative journalist, really going deep into those stories. So we're going to get into those two documentaries in a second. But again, welcome. We're super excited to have you on.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this space. I reached out to you because I think it's incredible and important work that you're doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Likewise, I feel the same. So we're gonna start big. I to really ground our conversation. Obviously, the theme of this conversation is going to be centering around your work as an investigative journalist for the BBC I and BBC Africa, and also your work as a producer reporter. So in that light, in you being this kind of investigative journalist who's focused on stories of people of color, could you share one striking statistic or fact that really underscores why telling stories about Black and Brown people around the world matters? Like, why should our audience really care about this if they don't already?
Mm. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind and that I always think of is the fact that, the African continent is such a young continent.
Hmm.
Young in many ways, but let's just take age, for example. There's so many young people who are keen to hear stories reflecting who they feel they are. Now, if
Hmm.
you expand that out even further and you look at the African diaspora and how incredibly huge we are, how many continents we span, and collectively, I don't have the statistic to hand, but collectively, our wealth and our power, our potential power, I think that already grounds you in the idea of why we should be investing in stories like this and in kind of connecting to be able to share stories that kind of reflect each other's experiences and that we can learn from each other's experiences. There's a quote that I really love, or just a concept, and it was from Walter Rodney. And he was speaking to people who identify as Pan-African. Not everyone has to, but for people who identify as Pan-African,
Hmm.
this idea that in sharing our story, we encourage Black people elsewhere to reflect on their own experiences and how they relate to each other.
Hmm.
And I think that's a really powerful idea as well. So I think there's so much power in thinking about a continent that is so young, and us as the seeds of that continent as well, however far removed we are. And yeah, I'd say that's why we need to have conversations like this and document our experiences.
In a minute, we're going to get into why you chose this path, this career path, right? Because it's a very niche, specific career path. You're not just a journalist; you're an investigative journalist, and you're not just an investigative journalist for all stories, but specializing in stories having to do with people of color, people in the global South. So we'll get into, like, in a minute, why you chose this path, or maybe the path chose you. Um, but let's start just a little bit about you. Where did you grow up, and what was your life like growing up? What was little Runako life like?
So I grew up in Bristol. It's in like the southwest of the UK. It's a city with a fairly historic black population because of the Windrush. So you find, like, across the UK, especially in a lot of towns and cities with ports, you find congregations of black West Indian communities, or West Indian communities more generally. And my on my father's side, that's where his family kind of come into it. They moved down here, and
Mhm,
have had roots here for quite some time. When I was 11, I moved to London, and so I
mhm.
was raised between the two, and that was home, and that's how I originally grew up. And I grew up in a very small but mighty Pan-African community, mainly West Indian, mainly Caribbean people, but very African identified. And I think that's grounded me and is very present in my work today.
Which Caribbean country do your parents originate from?
Jamaica, Grenada, my stepmother's Gambian. So
Oh,
those
wow.
were the kind of three cultures that I grew with, and kind of, yeah, make me up, that I'm comprised of, if you like. Yeah. So Grenada and Carriacou, which is a sister island to Grenada. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Wow. So we're talking earlier before we started recording about how your name Runako is a Zimbabwean name, a Shona name.
Exactly.
Maybe that probably speaks to your parents' Pan Africanism, right? So why did they choose? How did they come about that name? Two Caribbean parents with a Zimbabwean name.
Absolutely. I mean, so the era, I'm born in the 90s. And so during that era, that was a massive wave of Pan-African sentiment in Caribbean communities. And for lots of people, that meant a reconsideration of identity. And when you think of identity, you think about names, you think about culture, heritage, all of these things. And my parents decided, let's give our children names that reflect their cultural identity. So we are Caribbean, yes, but we are African Caribbean. And so my older sister had a name that was East African. That was picked for her. It also means the same thing that my name means, which is beauty or beautiful. And so when they had another daughter, they thought we could cause some trouble if we didn't give her a name that had a similar meaning.
Mhm.
Let's choose a name from a different country that also carries a similar meaning. And I think whenever they think about meaning and the importance of meaning in children's names, they always tell me it's not an external beauty, it's about who you are and what you put into this world that
Yeah.
should reflect that idea of beauty. Yeah, so it grounds me and reminds me of who I want to be.
Wow, that's quite interesting. So your parents were these strong Pan Africans, apparently from your upbringing, how you were named. Did you embrace Pan-Africanism early on in life, or did you even embrace your name? It's a different name, right? Growing up in Bristol, I'd imagine
Yeah.
that it's not a name that you did. You embrace that earlier, or was there this kind of like hesitation to really embrace that?
Yeah, I mean, luckily, I think we were so engulfed in this community, our social circles, or the young people that we went around, kind of, especially at a young age, really reflected and kind of helped to consolidate that idea and that identity. So I never pushed back against it. What I would say, though, is that, and I think this is the same of any kind of ideology or worldview that you grow up around, religion, I'd put that in the same category. There comes a point where you have to decide, is this who I am, or is this who I was kind of trained to be?
Hmm.
And I think a large part of that, and I will come to that later in the conversation, for me was going to China, a world away from home and everything that I grew up around. No one knows me. Who am I going to be here? And that, I think, experiences like that, it doesn't have to be a particular country in a particular place, but experiences like that are so important for grounding an
Yeah,
individual in who they are in their own right. Because sometimes we're just parroting narratives that we grew up around, and other times this is genuinely, intrinsically who I feel I am. So at this life stage, and at this after those experiences, I can say, yes, I still identify with so much of what I grew up with. Not everything now, but so much of it. um yeah, but I had to kind of go through that experience to say that.
yeah. You had to almost kind of step away from that world to kind of affirm, your identity and see if you're truly part of it. Almost like you tested it out out in the world in a way. But I want to get into this documentary. Arguably, your most recent documentary would be Death in Dubai, right? Which is a striking piece of work. As I said, I rarely, usually when I do these interviews, I usually kind of go in and try to be neutral about the work that my interviewees are doing. But in this case, I cannot hold back. I was actually blown away by Death in Dubai. I
Thank
started watching it and like I was gonna watch the first 10 minutes and go do something else and then come back to it. And I sat through it for the entire hour. And I went through a range of emotions watching Death in Dubai. So for our listeners who haven't seen it, if you could just give us like a quick synopsis of, a 2-3 line synopsis of what Death in Dubai is about.
Yeah. So thank you, first of all. Death in Dubai centers around some events that took place on the 1st of May 2022 involving a young African Ugandan woman called Monica Kurunji. She was 23 years old and she was in Dubai and she fell to her death from a high rise there. And we essentially tried to investigate what happened and the circumstances that led to her being in Dubai. Monica had never left her home country of Uganda prior to traveling to Dubai. And we learned that she was offered an opportunity in Dubai by men who work there and operate businesses there. And essentially, we hear allegations that once women are brought to Dubai, they are forced, coerced into prostitution and made to pay back ridiculous amounts of money in order to secure their freedom. And this is the backdrop against which Monica lost her life. We also hear about another young woman called Kayla Burunji, who was also in her 20s, her early 20s, had her whole life ahead of her, and lost her life in similar ways. And this is a kind of, it's like a little look at what is a massive industry and issue affecting lots of African women, unfortunately. Yeah, so that's Death in Dubai.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a pretty striking story, and we all, I'm sure many of our listeners know about the Dubai porta potty scandal that was kind of made viral on TikTok of women, many of them, women of color who were in Dubai and engaging in prostitution and getting, having to do all kinds of degrading things
Mm,
for money and for men. So why this story? I mean, I imagine there's so many stories that come across your desk or that you think about doing. Why did this particular one rise to the top?
yeah, I guess, yeah, the first thing to say is the power of social media. What I always try to kind of think about with journalism, with investigations, is how to kind of engage audiences that may not have been engaged typically before. And with my first investigation, with subsequent ones like this as well, there's always been an angle that starts or exists online. I like to kind of, I like to join conversation that is already existing, and not to kind of be preachy or to kind of tell people, hey, look, you're doing everything wrong, but to join it and try to kind of broaden the discussion. And so with this, as you kind of pointed out earlier, there was a hashtag on TikTok that had 450 million views a few years ago, so it probably has even more now, called the Dubai Porta Potty. And essentially, it was lots of people spreading these rumors about women. Lots of them, I mean, the majority of them had no evidence, but just kind of pointing fingers at women, saying that they were being flown out to Dubai, paid lots of money to willingly kind of satisfy the fetishes of men in Dubai. And whether or not there are truth in elements of those rumors, for some, that's another case. But what really interested me was that there was this young Ugandan woman who, the internet didn't seem to know. No one online seemed to claim that they knew her or they were a friend of hers. But yet, there were content creators from the global north, from America, from the US, from Italy, who were telling her story for her and garnering millions of views for doing so. That power imbalance and that kind of dynamic of voices from parts of the world like this being able to kind of like tell stories that they wanted to and get resource and following from it made me really uncomfortable, and that was kind of already the kind of sign that I wanted to investigate
Hmm.
further. Yeah.
And it seems like that's a pattern in your work, right? Taking these stories that already have traction on social media and digging deeper into them and investigating them. So you do that with Death in Dubai, with the story of Monica Karungi, who was known as Mona Kiz online. And then you also did that with another documentary called Racism for Sale, where you were investigating, Chinese content creators, exploiting children in Africa for entertainment purposes. Um,
Yeah.
so with Death in Dubai, what was the initial reaction from your team at the BBC when you first pitched this story? Was there excitement? Was there hesitation? How was it initially received?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I mean, absolute kind of outrage, number one, and what was likely going on. At the time when you first start to look into something, you don't know the full picture. However, there was absolute outrage, and everyone was kind of in agreement that this needs to be investigated further. And I think that's really important. Everywhere you go, you will have those people that will understand issues like this, no matter who the victim or who's on the receiving end of this treatment, in this case, like Monica. But it was immediate kind of, right, what do you need to to get this made, essentially. I should also say there was a team of us, right? So I led the investigation, I produced and reported it, but I did it in collaboration with an amazing production company called Thread Studios, and it was commissioned by Mus Khalili, who runs BBC Arabic, and just was so supportive, so supportive. So you kind of look for people like that are going to understand issues and want you to take it all the way. And I think that's a testament to what we achieved. So, for anyone who hasn't seen it, we go to Dubai. We at great risk and in lots of ways, go to Dubai to investigate further. I kind of pose as an influencer to access the kinds of spaces that this industry operates in and runs in. And we eventually meet via undercover filming, the men allegedly behind the network and behind this whole business. So it was made possible by, I'm not the most powerful person in this industry, so it was made possible by lots of people more senior than me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So you had a whole team behind you, and you kind of need that, right? And from what I understand, the documentary was 2.5 years in the making, over 2 years in the making. So this is, I think people take that for granted that with these pieces, that it's very
Mm.
time consuming and it takes a while to develop this. Um, and I couldn't. Well, all I could think of when I learned that it took you 2.5 years to make this documentary was the fact that just for the 1 hour that I watched it, I was so emotionally drained. Like after I watched it, I came and talked. I told my husband, I said, I need like some kind of a brain break because. So, what is it like for you having to live this? Talking to these women, going to the families of these women who died in Dubai, because of this, sex trafficking network, basically. How do you live that? How do you not get emotionally drained for in 2 years of living this and really digging into this story?
This is a question that, like, I've had before, and to be honest, there's not really an answer that I could give, because the reality is it is exceptionally heavy. It's very, very heavy, and difficult, knowing that the topic area, as a woman, as a human, full stop. But also, 2.5 years, part of massive chunks of that time is the time that I spent kind of getting to know Monica's family, getting to know Kayla's family, understanding their experiences and their own traumas with, imagine the whole internet dogpiling, like, is that the word? Dogpiling on your loved one. It's like it's a death multiple times. It's a loss multiple times, because you've already lost this person, and now you have to, put up with the whole world telling her story. And it's different to what you know them to be. So I think when I think about the hardest thing, it's meeting Monica's family and Kayla's family, and knowing that, yes, there is some respite, or there's some kind of feeling of joy from this work being out there. And for them, it's kind of like, okay, the world knows now. But ultimately, Kayla's gone and Monica's gone. So the hardest thing is knowing that you can't do everything.
Mm-hmm.
You can't ultimately erase what has happened or what has already gone. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I would say that's probably the most difficult thing to deal with. And the way that I try and balance that, is just a lot of breaks, and making sure that, as much as I love investigative journalism, and investigative journalism in particular that holds power to account, and that, you know, explores issues that maybe many people might shy away from. I also try and make sure I have other things existing in my universe as well,
Hmm.
because it's not really healthy to kind of just constantly be dealing with the worst things that are happening in the world.
Yeah,
Yeah,
especially when those things are affecting people who look like you, people that you can identify with.
yeah,
And that's another thing. Do you sometimes leave okay, this is like a thing, it was a kind of like a running joke, which is really not a joke back in the 90s, that if you go watch like a slave movie, right? Like a, you know, an African American slave movie, you come
yeah,
out angry at everyone outside of the theater, you know, who you think could have been a perpetrator of that.
yeah,
Do you sometimes, after a day of investigation and, you know, like for instance, a death in Dubai, talking to these women's families,
yeah.
seeing how they were treated in Dubai, do you go back to your hotel room angry in any way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, you know, I try and be as human and as real as possible in my journalism for that reason. I will cry, I will any emotion that I feel, I
Mhm.
don't want to, you know, I don't want to censor that, because at the end of the day we're human. So always anger is a kind of a continuous kind of feeling when you think about the level of exploitation that is happening in this world, not
Mhm.
even just in this investigation. You know, it just reminds you of how unjust things feel. I
Yeah.
think I try and channel that as far as I can into the work itself. You
Mhm.
know, it's like sometimes we're not allowed to include everything that happens behind the scenes in an hour long documentary, right? But if we were there for 2.5 years, just imagine the amount of kind of non-stop kind of efforts that we made to kind of hold people to account or to confront people and those types of things. And so I try and use that frustration to make the investigation as watertight as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but the frustrations are always there, always, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I had like some people in my network, like friends of mine, also watch the documentary because I just kind of wanted to have someone who was not going to be talking to you watch it and kind of get their visceral reaction to it. And I think the resounding feedback I got from everyone was like, this seems personal for Runako.
Mm,
Talking about these women and what they went through in Dubai and how they were treated, it doesn't seem like just another filmmaker making a film about something that she's kind of passionate about. It felt almost personal, and almost like you'd internalize it in a good way. Like,
mhm,
and that comes through, as you said. I was taken aback. Like I was crying at a certain point when you go to Uganda to this small village that, you know, Monica is from, and go interview her family, and they start crying and talking about the fact that they, you know, she went to Dubai and they had big hopes, and I got emotional, and I noticed that you were getting emotional, and I think that took me aback. I'm used to seeing documentaries where the filmmakers or the people you know, telling the story are more objective, but you're not afraid to kind of like hug the victims of the families,
yeah,
or the family's victims.
yeah,
There's this one particular part or this scene where you go to this the unmarked grave of Monica. So her body was never taken back to Uganda after she died in Dubai. It was buried in some kind of, you know, graveyard in Dubai, and
yeah,
you go there and you can't even find her gravesite because it's not even marked. And you break down crying with this, you know, floral arrangement in your hand that you brought to kind of pay your respects. And at that moment, I said, "This is personal for
mm,
this girl. It's not just, you know, this doesn't feel like just someone just making a film or doing her job. It felt really, really personal." And at that point, I was inspired by you, but almost also kind of worried for you because I go, a part of me will go, has something happened to her
mm,
that made her pursue this particular story this hard?
mm,
Um, because I felt that it was bigger than just a story that you were telling for, you know, a network that you're working for. It felt like,
mm,
I don't know if the word is redemption or a moment for you. Um, and I think that's what makes the piece even more powerful because you're in the story. You're not just telling it as an observer. You seem to be part of it.
mm,
And because of that, I, as a viewer, felt like I was a part of the story, and I saw myself in these women. I saw my aunts or my cousins in these women. My cousins who are back in Cameroon. I saw that.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it became personal for me as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting for me to hear your reflections as another African woman, as another woman of African heritage, you know, because I think it speaks to how it's very difficult not to feel connected to an experience that you know could have been you had you not been born in the circumstances that you were. It's very, very, you know, you feel it. Of course, in my case, I do. And then I think another factor for me has always been, and this goes back to what we were talking about slightly earlier, when I think of the fact that there's less of a blueprint. So when I look at investigative journalism in the UK, I looked around and I tried to say to myself, okay, who do I model what I want to put out there on? And there wasn't really much to follow. There were people who didn't kind of look like me or didn't sound like me who were doing investigative journalism and doing incredible, incredible work. But I had to start thinking, what does it look like for someone like me? Because even if people don't want to claim it, your identity always plays a role in anything that you do. What does it look like for me to do this job and for me to do this work? And that's when I started to realize that I wanted it to feel deeply human. And I didn't want to feel like I was this kind of stiff upper lip, kind of, very disattached person when I'm seeing some of the worst atrocities, you know, children being exploited, being, who are already living very difficult circumstances, young women with their lives ahead of themselves, losing their lives, you know. I didn't want to be a kind of cold, stern observer in situations like that. And I think it was important for me to feel like it was okay to do that. Yeah, so it's always a hard balance. I don't want to kind of always look weak or always look, but I also want to kind of make sure that I feel human in moments like those two. Um, yeah, so that's it, and that's those are reflections of years after doing this work. So when I first joined the industry and was kind of looking left, looking right, and feeling like, oh my gosh, am I really supposed to be here? There's no one like
Mm-hmm.
me here. I kind of felt like monkey see, monkey
Mm-hmm.
do. I'm just gonna, if anyone else stands there and just reports like this and just I have to do the exact same thing. And it's only with time and again, kind of speaking to people I'm in community with, like like I mentioned, that I've come to this kind of balance of actually this is how I choose to
Mm-hmm.
present. I also understand, as with anything, it's not going to be for
Mm-hmm.
everyone, and that is perfectly okay as well. You have to kind of be okay with that. Yeah,
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 no, that's your personal brand of investigative journalism, I think. And you're owning it and embracing it, which is that, yes, I'm gonna hug someone who's crying if I feel like I need to hug them while I'm interviewing them. I'm going to,
yeah,
cry when I feel like, I need to cry.
yeah.
So I think that's what makes it, like you said, more human and makes, I think, the viewer connect even more to the story that you're telling. So let's talk about. I don't want to. I want to give our viewers a little bit more context about this woman who's kind of like the main character, if you will, of Death in Dubai, which is
Mhm.
Monica. So give us a quick synopsis of Monica and like what happened to her in Dubai.
Yeah, so Monica Kurunji, she was the youngest of 12. She came from a massive, massive family. And everyone that I spoke to, all of her family, all of her siblings that I met and spoke to, they kind of described her as the rebel of the family, the one who wanted to change everyone's life and who wanted to kind of do her own thing. She very early on said, village life is not for me. The family live in a beautiful, beautiful area in Western Uganda. It's just the most scenic thing you'll ever see. But she said, this is not the life I want. I want to really make something of myself, something different of myself, because they made something of themselves as well. Um, and she said that she was going to go overseas, and I think anyone, you spoke about being from a kind of migrant background, your families, you've got immigrant parents and stuff, anyone can kind of relate to that idea of trying to go from X to Y or going somewhere else in the hopes of a better life. And then also in lots of cultures of the world as well, there's this feeling of wanting to support elder relatives, whether it's parents, grandparents, etc., etc. And that was a kind of instinct that she felt as well. And so, the first and only time that she would leave her country of Uganda was when she went to Dubai. So she was offered an opportunity. And according to her family, this was an opportunity to work in a supermarket in Dubai, which is quite common in that part of the world for people to go and have opportunities like that. Once she got to Dubai, gradually she starts to lose contact with her family. I think they first heard from her to say, "Yep, I've arrived safely." But one of her male relatives that I spoke to told me that there were warning signs from the beginning that everything wasn't exactly as it seemed. Agreeing to meet up at times because he too had moved to the UAE, and her disappearing, her not having a phone, her crying sometimes on the phone. And I just always imagined this sense of helplessness that her family felt, of not being well resourced enough to save their youngest of the youngest of the family, or to help her or to investigate what was happening to her. But knowing that there was some warning signs that everything wasn't okay. So she arrives in Dubai in December of 2021. And a few months later, which is going to the 1st of May 2022, she falls to her death from a high rise in Dubai. And kind of my job as an investigator was then to fill in the gaps of what happened in that interim period. How did she get there? But also, what was her reality like when she was there and living there? And so I built relationships with these just incredibly brave young women who said that their experience was exactly what Monica experienced, that they knew her, that they lived alongside her, and that they were essentially forced to kind of go to the clubs, and that their daily reality was being coerced into going to the super clubs of Dubai. These are the clubs that kind of people flock to in their hundreds and thousands each year, by the way. And, drinks are just ridiculously expensive. These are the places where you see supercars lined out front. And this was their kind of training ground, if you like. So this is where they were forced to kind of find men, and they had to work with these men, in a sexual manner. So that was what they were forced to do in order to pay off debts that they were told they incurred through their flights, through their accommodation, through their food. And I think one of the most haunting things that always stays with me about this is just how kind of well oiled this machine of exploitation was. So I was told that before you even get to Dubai, these women are made to send photos of themselves to their would be employers. And this is so that they can decide, how can I fashion this woman so that she can make me the most money in the Dubai market? Like produce, quite literally like produce. And we're talking about young women who have never left home before. I mean, one woman told me, I was just so young. I was so dumb. She even blamed herself, and it's like, it's so sad. But she was like, I was just 18. I've been 18. We've all been 18 once, right? And naive to the realities of the world, and what could await us for those who don't wish us well. And it just, that power dynamic and that power imbalance is one of the things that just always unsettles me about investigations like this. Yeah.
Yeah. In Monica's case, she was what, 21, 23 when she went to Dubai?
When she died. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So she gets there, and what she's expecting, right, people who brought her, is not what she gets. She's
Exactly.
essentially, forced to become, I don't know if the proper term is, a prostitute
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
to engage in prostitution. And then months later, she mysteriously falls to her death from a building, and it's deemed, or it's classified by the authorities in the UAE as a suicide,
Yeah.
right? As
Absolutely.
suicide. So you now go in to investigate and to kind of determine whether this was in fact, um, you know, a case of suicide, or whether there was some kind of other factors at play,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. And ultimately, we kind of got to the point of trying to understand those last moments for Monica. We did also contact the authorities in the UAE. They had no response. We still haven't had a response from them about any of the allegations that we hear in the film, including one which I think is really important, which is, there was this general feeling, both amongst the families of the two girls and amongst other Africans that I spoke to who are based in the UAE, that when issues like this occur for Africans in particular, there's an almost indifference. These cases are not being investigated thoroughly, is the feeling. And so those were kind of things that we wanted to understand from the UAE side. How do you respond to these sentiments and these allegations? But again, as I said, we had no response. Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's not unique to that part of the world. This is an issue that even the US is talked about a great deal, how stories involving Black victims
Yeah.
are under investigated. And that's why you have, platforms here like the Shade Room with Justin Carter, which, who actually go deep into some of these stories that are largely ignored by mainstream authorities. So it's sad to hear that even in that part of the world, and in the UAE,
Mm,
that this is the same issue, that their African immigrant victims are not being investigated. So let's talk about that a little bit, about kind of, if you call it the region of Asia and the experience of Black immigrants there. You yourself lived in China
mm.
for a few years, correct? How much of what you saw African immigrants, especially women, experiencing in the UAE and Dubai, is similar to your experience living in China? And
Yeah.
what they're not similar, and why do you think they're not similar?
That's quite an interesting question, actually. So I guess I'd never really thought about it. So yeah, so as I said, 7 years. I was there for about 7 years, and I was living in Beijing. I was in the capital city. I think I was always very conscious of variations in experiences based on privilege, essentially. The reality was I am British by nationality, and that, unfortunately, we're not saying it should be the case, but I just have to be very aware that it affords me certain privileges in anywhere that I go. And so my experience overall was really great, really incredible. And I stayed there for such a long time for a reason. And there's lots of things that I would say are just incredible about being there. I think where things get a bit more complicated is in the experience where as it comes to race, and just, how blackness is perceived and treated there. And that's where I'd say there's a more kind of like monolithic experience. So it's not to say that it's always or all the time that it's the case, but racism is sometimes quite rife over there. I experienced it myself, and what I realized was that sometimes Africans in particular were at more risk of experiencing it directly. Could be because of factors like where they're likely to live, and who they're likely to come into contact with. But nonetheless, it was a massive issue. And so I think for me, I've always seen my role as a diasporan to be like, okay, if I know that I'm afforded certain privileges just because of my passport, then perhaps I can carry a bit more risk in speaking out about these things because of that privilege, right? It's kind of not necessarily to compensate, but it's to use it for something. It can't just be so that I can have a nice life and then forget
Yeah.
everyone else. I don't think that's how community should
Hmm.
operate. I always saw it as that. So in everything that I did there and in the journalism that I started to do while there, that was always the kind of modus operandi, right? So to think about, okay, this might not have happened to me. It might not have been on my doorstep, but this Ghanaian person over here has just told me that XYZ
Hmm.
happened and has this evidence and whatever else. So let's document this. Let's speak about
Yeah.
this. Prime example of this, 2020. So this is when COVID was kind of just rearing its head. Everyone's talking about it. Early stages in China, unfortunately, especially in the south of the country, there started to be lots of stigma around Africans and people of African descent because a narrative started to form on Chinese social media that Africans were to blame for the influx of COVID. Yeah, and so it's been widely covered. It was March, April 2020. But you started to see that lots of Africans were being thrown out into the streets of places like Guangdong province, in neighboring provinces as well. And there were other minor instances also happening elsewhere. So actually at the time, lots of embassies of countries with high black populations, Canada, Trinidad, etc., started to put little warnings out to their populations to be like, we're hearing stories like this, just be
Hmm.
careful, right? So if I'm there and I'm seeing this happening, I want to document and I want to speak about the realities of what's happening in the community, whether or not everything is happening to me or I'm experiencing every part
Yeah.
of it. Yeah, so that was my approach. And in terms of similarities, that was the last part of your question. um I would say the type of investigative work that I do
Hmm.
now, um I didn't I don't think I really knew at the time to look in depth enough to see whether the types of exploitation that is apparent in work like Death in Dubai and Racism for Sale were happening there at the time in China, for example. So, you know, things like this can happen anywhere. That's the reality. They're happening right here in the UK as well. And that shouldn't surprise anyone, right? These things happen globally. But I wouldn't say that I had evidence of similar things happening or similar exact experiences, you know, copy paste happening there because I wasn't looking for it at the time or I wasn't investigating it at the time.
So
Yeah.
going back to Death in Dubai, so there's this young woman, this happens to her, and this story is basically centered around her. She's kind of the main, the focal point of the story. But of course, through her, we hear the stories of other Ugandan women who faced similar challenges when they're in Dubai or were also part of this kind of forced prostitution. Um, so let's talk now about other stories in general. Like, let's go back to that, right? After talking about Death in Dubai. Are there other stories, if you had to choose like one story concerning people of color right now that you feel is most urgent that few people are talking about, what would that
Sudan, probably, you know, and I think it's important to say when you're not necessarily the most qualified person to speak about an issue. So I will be very top line in saying, but I feel like, you know, every time I see what is happening in Sudan currently, I feel like there is an under focus. There's not enough concentrated eyes and ears and attention on stopping what is happening there currently. So that comes to mind. I think that in general, kind of more broadly, um, I think about tech, newer forms of tech, and how specifically they are going to impact our communities globally across the board. And I wish that we had more mechanisms to share experience so that Afro Guyanese person can speak to a Ghanaian about what is happening in their communities and share knowledge and insight about how these new changes and developments are impacting them and how they can, you know, kind of uh, uh, combat some of the challenges or take advantage of the benefits of some of these new, you know, I think about AI, I think about what that's going to mean for us and things like that. So I think general topics like that are things that are being understudied. But yeah, the two things would be that and Sudan and what's happening there.
And for
Yeah.
our viewers, tell us pretty briefly what's happening in Sudan that you feel like requires more attention and it's not getting that attention.
There's been a long-standing conflict in Sudan now that is leading to loss of life on just a most catastrophic of scales. Women, children, men across society. And I think it's sometimes one of these things that you think of if it was happening elsewhere and if the people weren't African, would this be garnering more interest? You know, if this was happening in Europe, would it have been garnering more interest and would there be more of a concerted effort to put it to an end? That is not to kind of not give props to everyone who's been doing so much to document it. I mean, I follow some correspondents at Sky who have been doing Sky's broadcaster in the UK. There's a journalist called Yusra El Bajir, I want to say, who does some incredible work in documenting what's happening, who's of Sudanese heritage herself. So there's lots of things happening in terms of documentation, but what could be happening is always more. Yes, that's what I'd say. Can I add one more thing to actually that I didn't think of? But I'd also say climate as an important kind of topic that I don't think is focused on enough. We saw what happened with Hurricane Melissa most recently in Jamaica. Prior to that, the year before, there was Hurricane Beryl, which hit Carriacou, which is where my mother's family is from. And these kind of catastrophes of this type are only going to keep on happening and intensifying. I mean, I wrote an article this year for BBC Future, and it was about some of the kind of changes that we're seeing in the kind of generation of these hurricanes and how they are intensifying over time and what this might mean, especially for countries in the global
Yeah.
south. So I think that that's something as well that we need more
Yeah.
stories on,
Yeah.
more coverage on. Yeah.
So what's next for you? So you've talked about all these different stories, AI and how it affects people of color, the the situation in Sudan and the ongoing conflict in Sudan, and then climate change and how it's affecting people of color. Are you planning on pursuing any of these stories, or are there other stories that you are working on? Spoiler alert, tell us what you're working on next.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't let go of Death in Dubai and the topics relating to that. I think it's really important that, especially in these very fast moving times, that we don't kind of let things that are so important just slip by and just be another thing in the news cycle. There are real people's lives like behind so much of what's happening. So I am still kind of looking at ways to kind of continue documenting issues relating to that. I'm also, all of those topics are topics close to my heart. I always recognize, like I said, when I'm better placed at supporting efforts to document something rather than documenting it myself. Sudan being a prime example. The knowledge gap is just so huge for me that it's not my area of focus, but wherever I can amplify and assist efforts to document it, absolutely. And I'm also kind of returning in a way to the beginning of our conversation, my roots of how I was raised. I'm also looking at ways to document experiences of our communities globally and bring them closer together in a platform actually that I'm starting that kind of combines genealogy, which is the study of family history over time, with journalism to tell the kind of global stories of people of African descent who have traveled the world throughout and exist in almost every continent to date. So yeah, I'm forging a path with investigative journalism and carrying on down that path, but also trying to kind of make sure that my commitment to community storytelling is on par.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome, and that's great work, and we look forward to kind of seeing where you take that project. Before we go, I think there's something that we kind of not talked about that is really important to talk about, right? Which is the impact that these documentaries have had, like in the real world. Let's talk about Death in
Mm.
Dubai. Apparently, this has led to some legal action, or at least brought awareness to legal action taken against the perpetrators in the documentary, right?
There's lots that I can't currently say about what has happened next, but you're right. As a, we do this because we want impact and we hope that there's going to be some kind of result. So what we did hear and what, was alleged was that Mr. Mwasigwa, who is the man that the allegations at the center of lots of these allegations, was removed from Dubai and is no longer in Dubai. And so the business, which is the business that Monica found herself embroiled in, is no longer in existence. And so that's one thing that we do know. Before that, with Racism for Sale, which we kind of touched on, I think one of the things that we saw there was an arrest and compensation for the victims, which were young children and their family in Malawi, so not in Uganda, but in Malawi. And this is the type of impact that is possible through investigative journalism like that. And it makes the 2.5 years or the 2 years or, all of these projects so much more worth it. They were worth it regardless, because the second that you start to raise awareness about these issues, you start to stop the possibility of it happening to someone else or to minimize that possibility, right? So it's always worth it. But when you see things like that happening too, as a journalist myself, that's it makes it worth
Yeah.
it. So yeah, we saw discussions in parliament. We saw, some of my investigations have seen protests in the streets of countries, about these issues. And so it makes it feel like it's having an impact, it's making a difference.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think that's a good way to end and to say, if you were talking, so fast forward to 10 years from now, or let's even say 20 years from
Mm.
now, what do you
Wow.
want, kind of if someone had to sum up your legacy? Okay, you're a little young, so let's take it back. 20 years from now, you're still going to be young, right? Okay, let's start over. 50 years from now, what do you want people to say about the legacy and the imprint that you've left when it comes to telling stories about people of color?
I want I want to be seen as someone who was committed to telling our stories a way that led with that, in a way, sorry, that led with our humanity, that felt very much like it was made of us and not about us. And that goes back to that distinction I made at the beginning of, are you someone external who is kind of just parachuted in to tell stories of somewhere, or are you someone who has an intimate connection to that place and is therefore able to capture some of the nuance and some of the humanity and make it feel a bit more like um human. Yeah, a bit more of that texture. And that's what I want to be known for. I want to be known for someone who cares about community, and about telling stories of people of the global south and of the diaspora, broadly speaking, um, in a way that restores that feeling of humanity. Yeah.
Thank you, Runako. This has been a great conversation, and again, really inspired by the work that you're doing. If you haven't already, everyone, check out Death in Dubai. It is worth the watch. It's worth the 1 hour. And also Racism for Sale, another documentary that Runako has put out. Thank you so much.